The COVID crisis, I think, is just going to precipitate this happening faster with a lot more people being hurt along the way. But I think this process, could be managed. It could be a good thing. And that's why I encourage people who are listening to you to get out ahead of it and start to localize their finances as much as they can now.
This is Straight Talk in the COVID economy, and my name is Larry Quick. Our world has changed and there's no going back. The COVID economy is now very real. We are adapting to telework, Zooming, online learning and new industries like PanSafe and other opportunities revealed by COVID-19. The challenges are also with us: bankruptcies, unemployment, debt and confusion. In Straight Talk in the COVID economy, we meet thinkers and innovators who bring insight and information into the opportunities and risks of our rapidly emerging COVID economy. Straight Talk in the COVID economy is brought to you by Resilient Futures. This is alongside our partner, Impact Africa Network. Impact Africa Network is an innovation incubator based in Nairobi, Kenya. It seeks to be a catalyst for the next Silicon Valley in Africa. Impact Africa Network needs all the support we can provide. So please donate at www.impactafrica.network.
Hi and welcome everybody. I'd like to introduce my good colleague and friend, Michael Shuman. Michael's an economist, attorney, and author and entrepreneur. What a mix that is. And I've found him to be, and he's stated to be, a leading visionary in community economics. Now that is a whole area in itself that I find intriguing because, economists usually are these grand scale, in my view, unpractical understandings of how life really works. Having worked with Michael in Australia, I've found him to be so practical and on the ground and revealing in some of the things that he has found and talks about as a community economist. He's Director of Local Economy Programs from Neighbourhood Associations Corporation and an adjunct professor at Bard Business School in New York City, and a senior researcher for Council Fire and Local Analytics, where he performed economic development analysis for states, local governments and businesses around North America. So hi, Michael.
Nice to be with you, Larry.
Great to be with you, mate. And I'm so much looking forward to talking to you, but not only that, but getting back in touch. We worked back in, I think it was 2012, was it?
It was somewhere around there. I was trying to remember that. It may have even been as late as 14 or 15.
Could have been, but I know that we had you up in Wood End, our little village up here, and we tried so hard to get some things happening. But so often what we find different to our work from Resilient Futures perspective in the US, where we primarily worked in disenfranchised communities there, that we don't have a lot of that. Apart from Aboriginal communities, which are very disenfranchised, we don't have a lot of that work happening in Australia, or a lot of those conditions. But I think this time has now changed. And in sort of setting the interview up with Michael, I was sort of revealing to him the work that we've done or doing in understanding very rapidly emerging COVID economy and beyond. And we see the COVID economy as, there's been a big drop off in the old economy working, and that which was already failing, as we've seen it. So many systems were collapsing under that, and not least our climate systems with fires, we're having the floods, etc. But also economic systems really being unequal, etc., etc. I can talk all day about that. But in the COVID economy, we're obviously seeing some risks that are emergent there. Unemployment is over the top, all sorts of things happening, and some big issues that will arise, particularly in September, October of this year with debt, etc., etc. But the things that we've been talking to Michael about in the emergence of telework and working community. We're seeing a lot of that taking place, which actually fits so totally your model, Michael. Also the idea of online learning and the future of work, being able to locate that back into where you live rather than having to travel long distances. and go into socially distanced places which are no longer viable. Micro manufacturing and local supply networks, community talent attraction and retention, all of these things now being available to local communities to start to really look at how they can be leveraged in a disruptive change for sustainable value generation. So I've asked Michael today to talk about local dollars kept in local communities, transfer of capital to where you work and live. And this is one of the things we tried to get to happen with Michael when he was here, was how do we get local superannuation investment in local community development? So how do you get to invest in local communities, and how do we get community development corporations happening in Australia similar to the way they happen in the USA? So Michael, I'm just going to throw it open and start talking about local dollars in local communities.
Right. Well, first, I'll just pile on with your analysis and say that I do think that the COVID economy opens up a lot of interesting opportunities, and one of those opportunities is that people are more skeptical, more nervous about public markets, and more interested in moving, if they can, some of their life savings into their Main Street wherever they are. And the tools for doing that have become more available, more affordable, and more sensible. Um, so in the US, I just published a book called Put Your Money Where Your Life Is, which is really, it's sort of a summation of where I think the local investment movement is in the United States. But, to put this a little bit in perspective, in our country, investment crowdfunding was effectively legalized in 2016. And since then, 400,000 Americans have participated in investment crowdfunding. That is where they go online and they find small businesses they think are exciting and they invest in them. Sometimes it's loans, sometimes it's a stock investment, sometimes it's a royalty investment. And the typical company online has raised about $270,000. The average investor has put in $800. The biggest beneficiaries have been businesses run by women and people of color. That is, those who are most neglected by the traditional capital markets, venture funds, hedge funds, banks, and so forth. So we know that grassroots crowdfunding is really beginning to fill a vital niche in the economy. The last time I was in Australia was a little more than a year ago, and at that point, your crowdfunding in Australia had just been legalized, and I spent a little time with the people in Brisbane, the Food Connect people, who did do a successful crowdfunding raise for a facility, a warehouse facility for their local food distribution. And what I can tell you about that experience, to me, is very much true of the experience in the US, and also, I think, true universally. And so what we found is that maybe half of the money for the Food Connect offering came from deep pocket, angel-ish kinds of investors. And those investors were very interested in whether this investment was going to generate a 4% rate of return, a 5% rate of return. The rest of the investors were hundreds of mostly women who put in small dollar amount of investments, and they did not really care what the rate of return was. As long as it was a positive rate of return and people were going to get their money back, that's all they cared about. And I see that as a really important tool, because what it's saying is that investment is only partially about your personal or private rate of return. Investment is also about your social rate of return, about what it does for your community. And I think, the period of COVID is forcing all of us to rethink our relationship with our communities. In a way, it has made our communities more important, and it has made our need, our desire, the urgency really of putting our money into our local businesses more important. I'll tell you one thing that I did in the US is that I decided that, here we're on the precipice of losing hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of businesses. And I think it's very important for Americans to adopt at least one local business. Uh, Hopefully, you might have the resources to adopt several. And so, what I did, there's a really lovely restaurant, bookstore, bar near me that I know was struggling, named Busboys and Poets. And I approached the owner, an Iraqi American citizen named Andy Shalal, and I said, Andy, I estimate that over the next year, I'm going to spend in a typical year $1,000 on meals at your place. I'm going to give you the $1,000 right now. I'm lucky that I can afford to give you that $1,000 now. And I want you to just give me gift cards to cover it. And I want you to have that money now so you can keep more employees on payroll. And he was so thrilled with that act of adoption that he gave me a 20% bonus. So I now have $1,200 to spend on meals there. And one way of looking at this from a hard-headed investment standpoint is I got a 20% rate of return on my investment, which I challenge anyone in the conventional markets to say they've done. But I say to your listeners, think about all of the businesses you love. Think about businesses that may be in trouble as a result of some form of the shutdowns that have happened in recent months. Reach out to them as I have. If you can't do an advance purchase, maybe that business needs capital in the way of a loan or a stock investment, and work with that business to maybe get them to do a crowdfunding offering. Now, there's another issue, and that is how do you tap your superannuation funds? And the key piece that I have written about in my most recent book is how Americans can do the equivalent with what we call IRAs, individual retirement accounts, or 401ks, which are workplace pension funds, and using what are called self-directed IRAs or solo 401ks, Americans can begin to localize some of their investments. I am less familiar with the laws in Australia, although my good friend and colleague Gilbert Roche-Couste, who runs the Village Well in Melbourne, I know took money out of his pension fund pre-COVID to create a open workspace underneath the house that he lives in as a kind of localized investment. So I know it can be done, but it's a little more complicated.
Yeah, it's amazing you say that, because we've just had a situation with superannuation. It's a damned if you do, damned if you don't. Or I think the way it stacks up is damned if you don't, because you don't get that forced saving, because ours is forced. And it's not work-based. It's everyone who works gets a percentage, 10%, I think is at the moment, going up to 12% of their salary or wages, automatically taken out and put into a superannuation fund, which you can choose, and you can't touch that. What's happened is that, given that the COVID economy COVID-19 kicked off, what was immediately injected into back into a COVID economy was you could withdraw an amount of money from your superannuation if you could prove hardship. and that has been it's been done by a lot of people. Some rorts have taken place. There's been some fraudulent activity, but by and large, that's actually happened for immediate need. But I don't think we've actually understood what the mechanisms are for local investment. And I can see we're starting to think that way, but at the scale of community development corporations, which are local, if you call them, I call them local organisers or local activists, that can get together and form a proper, under law, organisation. They're not for profit, apart from what they can develop in the community and give back to the community. So, can you talk a bit about that, your experience with those organisations?
Yeah, sure. So there's a kind of wide range of kinds of companies that you can create in the United States pretty easily, pretty inexpensively. Nonprofits, co-ops, various forms of private corporation with interesting different ownership structures, public-private partnerships. So all of these things can be given, I think, an interesting social purpose. And, you introduced me partially by mentioning that I teach for Bard Business School, and the course that I teach is called Sustaining Mission. And so I teach second-year business students how to measure and keep up kind of social engagement with whatever business model they've chosen. So I tend to be a fan of all business models because I think all business models have some real potential for great social purpose if the proprietors wish to do that. Now, community development corporations are interesting because they were created during the 1960s when the then president Lyndon Johnson had a declared war on poverty. And he decided to make it easy for neighborhoods to create these sort of nonprofit vehicles. But I've talked to some of the people who were involved in the creation of community development corporations, and many of them regard the framework of CDCs, that's what we call them, as nonprofits as a big mistake. And that is that because they are nonprofit, they are forever in the position of trying to raise capital in awkward ways. So they have to beg for money from philanthropists. They have to constantly be writing grants to foundations. They maybe are applying for schemes that the government is offering. So in a way, they've become far too dependent on wealthy individuals rather than building their capital out of grassroots investment. And that's what some people think was the mistake. So I think that if Australians move ahead and create a specialized animal to serve community development, I encourage you to keep a for-profit structure. But, when you can keep a for-profit structure and really make sure the profit is little or none and keep all the surplus going for the mission, and people are clear that's what you're trying to do. One of the advantages in the United States of structuring things that way is the laws that limit nonprofits. For example, they can't do lobbying, they can't do advocacy on legislation. But a for-profit corporation in the United States can do all those things. So in a way, your degrees of freedom may be a little bit broader if you take on a more conventional corporate structure, but set up the governance and the ownership in ways that keep that social purpose.
Have you seen any of that type of innovation take place at the community level with B corporations?
Yes. So for your listeners who may not be familiar, B corporations was a designation of company that started with a nonprofit called B Lab in 2006. And the idea was to create a framework for evaluating the social performance of businesses originally on 4 metrics, and now it's on 5. So on governance, community, workers, environment, and now customer responsiveness. And if you score high enough on these metrics, you have the privilege of using the B for beneficial insignia, like a good housekeeping seal, a good community keeping seal. Um, and you also become part of a kind of global network of interesting socially minded companies. And at this moment, I believe the worldwide count on B Corps is somewhere north of 3,000 of designated B Corps. So the way that it is played out in the United States is we also have a bunch of laws at the state level that allow companies that are interested in becoming B Corps, but maybe are at the beginning of their journey. They can reincorporate in something like 35 US states as benefit corporations. And so they're still for profit, still sort of have the same ownership structure, but by being benefit corporations, they sort of change up their articles of incorporation and their bylaws and basically say we're doing business not just for our investment shareholders, but for a variety of stakeholders, the workers, the suppliers, the community, the environment, and so forth, and thereby inoculate themselves from shareholder actions of an old variety that could possibly say, why aren't you just paying attention to investors? So yeah, so there's a couple of thousand benefit corporations in the United States. I sometimes think of them as B Corp light because you don't have to necessarily achieve a certain level of performance in order to become a benefit corporation, but at least you're on the pathway.
Yeah, and I guess it's sort of, I don't think there's any sort of bell to be rung in America about the inequities in communities, whether that be minorities or even the people that have been disenfranchised through economic change, global economic changes and globalization, if you like. Particularly, say for instance, when we're in Ohio a couple of years ago, seeing the ravaging nature of the loss of jobs there through just shifting global forces and even American forces, so that we don't have that immense pressure at the moment that is showing up in America and seeing sort of the breakdowns that are occurring there. From an Australian perspective, it is coming. I think the winter of discontent in Australian communities is about to hit us in ways we don't know, but there are so many opportunities there that can manage themselves against the risks. And if I could just take a little bit of time, that traditional economics says, from at least definitely from an Australian perspective, is that when you get a downturn, the way to go is invest in infrastructure. Construction jobs are what counts. We build large, we have very large shovel-ready projects. Let's go with it. And I mean, that was the nature of GFC stimulus in the US when I was working there. And it tends to be happening here now. But the thing I say is, well, if the square meter economy is under attack, and if we were to say, give it a number, 40 to 50% of workers are now going to be not traveling, they're going to be in community, where should those those infrastructure projects happen? if you're building freeways to densified areas, what's the point of that? Or if you're building big buildings, what's the point of that? If you're building the same buildings that can't be used now, what's the point of that? So what the level of investment that could then take place in localised communities in building, community hubs or telework industry, investing in the telework industry, supporting that has massive amount of support that needs. You need ergonomics, you need people who haven't got the right space or haven't got the national broadband network working, all of those sorts of things. Online learning going into local structures. As we've talked about, micro manufacturing and new supply networks, and the amount of shift that we can have outside of these fully densified areas in cities. And I think that type of investment is at least a good proportion of any stimulus done is a good thing to do. So what are your thoughts on, if there is going to be stimulus, where should it be put?
Yeah, well, absolutely. I agree with you about the shifts that are going on in the economy, and I would even go further and say that there is a fundamental shift in the goal of economics and economic development. For 200 years, we have kind of followed the thinking of David Ricardo, who was the author of the theory of comparative advantage. And Ricardo argued, and this is a bit of a simplification, but basically argued that every country, every state, every jurisdiction should find a couple of things that they are really great at producing, world-class goods and services, as they've come to be known in the nomenclature of economic developers, and import everything else. And it's fair to say, I think, that jurisdictions worldwide have embraced this idea of economic development. Now we know, I think, in the COVID world, how insane this is, because the more dependent your economy is on a few production nodes and lots of imports, the more vulnerable you are to COVID, to sudden cutoffs in supplies, to an oil cutoff, to a food shortage. So I argue now that the most competitive communities are going to be the most self-reliant. Uh, the most self-reliant on basic goods and services. And I think because of that, there is an emerging comparative advantage to a lot of once forgotten smaller communities, because smaller communities have people living in them, and it's now become obvious that, gee, we should not be driving 20, 50, 100 kilometers out. We should be providing goods and services for our own people. And frankly, even small places can competitively provide many critical goods and services, food, energy, water, uh, basic basic housing at a small scale. And so that's really what's going on now. The cutting edge is the reinvention of economies at a smaller scale. And I think that's just consistent with what you said about don't throw your money at unnecessary infrastructure in places that are going to be obsolete. So, you know, when I am talking now with communities about how you should rethink economic development, I think that there are a lot of things that cities can do in the name of better economic development that either costs nothing or actually save them money. So I'm going to give you three examples. First of all, a city should stop wasting money on attracting outside companies, which is largely what economic development has become all about. If you stop wasting that money, you've got more money available for other forms of economic development that we know are cheaper and more effective. Number two, change your procurement system, your public procurement system, so that you actually take into account all of the advantages that come from local procurement. And here's what's kind of weird about public procurement right now, is that they pretend that they're going after the lowest bidder, but they can't pay attention, or they don't pay attention to what happens to the tax dollars that may come back to that jurisdiction. And if you spend your money locally as a public authority, your tax returns are going to be greater. So if you take those tax returns into account, you will have a lower expenditure for the same goods and services, you will have more local spending, and you will have a stronger economy. So that's really a very simple form of stimulus. And number three is really thinking about the local investment pieces we just talked about. And I think it's worth saying that local investment, I think we're all starting to appreciate, is not just investment in local businesses. It can be investment in municipal projects that are led by your city. If the city can figure out how to issue securities that are purchasable by people living in the community for, say, solar energy production, or stormwater management, or affordable housing. The really bad features of COVID is that tens of millions of people are going to emerge out of this pandemic with a weaker personal finance position. They will be deeper in debt. Many will owe, billions more, trillions more in credit card debt. So one of the arguments I'm making now is that we should prioritize with friends and neighbors, helping to pull them out of debt. And I know the numbers are a little bit different in Australia, but just to put this in perspective, in the United States, the average credit card holder in the United States pays 17% per year on interest. And that number can easily go up to 25% or 30% if you have a penalty, a missed payment. So let's just call it 20%. If every dollar that I spend on someone getting out of a credit card debt, in theory, has a 20% rate of return. So I could split that with someone so that maybe they pay me 5% and they're enjoying 15% from that transaction. It's not just credit card debt, it's student loan debt, it's mortgage debt, it might be debt around building greenhouses in your house or making your house more energy efficient. So I think we can be very creative about rebuilding our communities and financing it with one another. Now, again, I am deeply appreciative that we have to develop some good tools for you folks to access your superannuation funds. And I'm going to get on it soon, I promise.
Well, I'm looking forward to that, mate, because I think what we're looking at, and I think it's similar in most places, that the winter that you're going to experience, or the fall you're going to come into, that leads to winter, we're going to be coming into the spring, which leads to our summer, and that debt that you're talking about, and the amount of bankruptcies and the organisations for little businesses and big businesses that are already insolvent. That comes home in sometime August, September, October. The reality of that, the debt, that sovereign and domestic debt that at least Australia's had, and many countries have, up to 2019, which was unsustainable. That is sort of still with us. The GFC, as has been stated to me, the global financial crisis, which we call the GFC, is not over, hasn't been over since it happened. We just don't trade in CDOs anymore, collateralized debt obligations. we now have traded in CLOs, collateralized loan obligations, which are about to come home because the way they've been structured to be AAA, AA, etc., is based on correlation modelling, where no one, if you have a bundle of CLOs together that have, which are all stressed business loans, have, very high margins, 25%, etc. They've all been bundled up and securitized, same as CDOs. You've got those distressed businesses have been mixed up so that the correlation aspect modelling said that they couldn't all go bust at the same time because it just doesn't happen. Now, you get in one industry, in retail, in one bundle of CLOs to
To
a
use the
manufacturer.
nuclear power analogy, we're now facing a common mode failure,
Yes,
which means where all those correlation models are totally obsolete because one
absolutely.
unexpected event
Yeah,
clobbered everything.
yeah. So that is coming to bear. There was an interesting thing I haven't looked at Brookings Institute. It was late at night and I've been looking for the webinar, but on Dodd-Frank, actually talking about what they saw the outcome of the lack of implementation, really, or enforcement of Dodd-Frank. Mnuchin, Treasury Secretary, comes out and says the banks aren't exposed to CLOs, which is wrong. They are throughout the world. And I just wonder, the second GFC is upon us in some shape or form. What is your immediate reaction to that comment?
I totally agree with you, and I can't say with confidence what's going to take the global economy apart. But here's the way that I look at it in terms of its vulnerability. So again, I'm going to use U.S. numbers, but they're not far.
Similar.
In terms of a big sense of things, it's very similar
Yeah.
to Australia. When you look at the long-term savings that Americans have in stocks, bonds, mutual funds, pension funds, and insurance funds, they total $56 trillion. That $56 trillion is about 100% invested in global corporate stocks and bonds.
Yep.
Now, what's perverse about that is that 60 to 80% of our economy is locally owned business, depending on how you define local. So in a effective capital market, and we could talk about that these local businesses, at least in normal times, are profitable and competitive.
Yep.
In a competent and effective capital market, 60 to 80% of those long-term savings would be going into local business, but none are. What that really means is that there's been a huge subsidization of global companies, where everyone is putting too much into global companies and nothing into effective local businesses. And I would argue that has been an enormous drag on the economy. So even without COVID, this thing was going to unravel at some point. And I feel like the shift from what we would say Wall Street to Main Street is going to happen anyway, and that will reduce the subsidy to global business and increase the prosperity of communities. The COVID crisis, I think, is just going to precipitate this happening faster, with a lot more people being hurt along the way. But I think this process, could be managed. It could be a good thing. And that's why I encourage people who are listening to you to get out ahead of it and start to localize their finances as much as they can now.
Words to my ears. Yeah, I totally agree with that. And I think one of the things that we have to do is rapidly decide as part of COVID economy as to how we do that in Australia. And in saying that, I'm hoping that we can do some work on that together. And we only need to find a way of doing that. Michael, as always, I could talk to you for hours. We've both got a hard stop at the same time. But I want to thank you so much. And can this be the first of many interviews we do into the future? And
I would love to do that.
Let's get a project happening in Australia around, and we can get a panel of people to work on that project to make it work ahead of time as part of our view of the COVID economy. We're launching the website today, the new Resilient Futures website. Our publication's out, first publication, Intrepid, Information That Counts, this is part of that. And also our COVID economy papers are starting to come out in July as well. So I want to thank Michael Shuman, as always, the man who thinks differently about everything that most economists think and can bring it so succinctly back into what it means for local communities. And I hope Australian ears are now really open to your ideas. And if I could also then put a very big plug into all of Michael's book, Put Your Money Where Your Life Is, How to Invest Locally, all of them. Just Google michaelschuman.com and you'll find them all there, and you can buy them off online. So thanks once again, Michael, and appreciate it. See you soon.
Thank you, Larry. Take care.
Thank you.
We hope you've enjoyed this Straight Talk in the COVID Economy podcast. Thank you for listening. And please subscribe on your preferred podcast platform. For more information about Resilient Futures, please visit www.resilientfutures.com, and please support our partner, Impact Africa Network, at www.impactafrica.network. We need all the support we can to help them build their own incubator. We know that there are many other great podcasts out there, and your time is precious, and you chose to listen to Straight Talk on the COVID Economy. And we appreciate that. Thank you.